This is the two-way table of the data that we've been looking at over our last several videos, and it is comparing the hours that a student studies to their test score. And in the previous video, we learned how to make a scatter plot from this data. And just to refresh our memory, a scatter plot displays bivariate data, and each point represents one observation with two values. And so what we learned how to do previously was to draw an x and a y axis, and then we plot the independent and dependent variables on the x and y axis, and then each point goes on this graph, and then we could label the points if we chose to, and doing so creates a trend that seems to move upward. And this upward trend shows a relationship between the variables. And in statistics, we call this an association. And an association describes the relationship between two variables. There are a few kinds of association that we're going to familiarize ourselves with. And the first is what's known as a positive association. And a positive association occurs when, as the independent variable increases, the dependent variable also increases. And when we plot this, what it looks like is points moving upward as we read the graph from left to right. So if we were to look at our hours studied and test score graph, what it would indicate is that the more hours you study, the higher score you would tend to get. And as x increases, y increases, and the points are moving upward from left to right. A positive association doesn't guarantee that someone who studies more will get a higher grade. In fact, you can see in this scatter plot that there are a few examples of people who studied for more hours that got a lower grade than people who studied less, but in general, more hours mean a higher grade, and that's what's known as a positive association. A negative association does exactly the opposite. A negative association occurs when, as the independent variable increases, the dependent variable tends to decrease. The example we have here is a graph comparing speed and travel time. And as you can see, the points are moving downward from left to right. So what this indicates is that a higher speed leads to a shorter travel time. In other words, if you travel faster, it will take you less time to get where you're going. As x increases, y decreases. And what this looks like on our scatter plot is points move downward from left to right. Again, not in a perfectly straight pattern. If you go at a very high speed, it doesn't necessarily mean you will arrive somewhere faster. For example, if you were driving in an area that had a lot of traffic lights or just a lot of traffic, you wouldn't necessarily get there faster than someone who was driving at a slower speed than you. But in general, if you drive faster, you will get where you are going quicker. The third type of association that we're going to look at is something called a nonlinear association. So these are two variables that are related to each other. They're just not variables that are related in a linear pattern. So the example we're looking at here is one comparing hours since sunrise and temperature. And this pattern curves instead of forming a straight trend. That's what makes this a nonlinear association. And hours since sunrise forms a nonlinear association because in the middle of the day is when the temperature tends to be hottest, and it tends to be cooler at the beginning and the end of the day whenever the sun is not at its highest point. So a nonlinear association occurs when, as the independent variable increases, the dependent variable will either increase and then decrease, or sometimes vice versa. It will decrease and then increase. This is not the only type of nonlinear association. Anytime you see a pattern, but the pattern is not a straight line, that is an example of a nonlinear association. So when you can see that the two variables are related to each other, but the pattern they're making is not a straight line, that's a nonlinear association. The last type of association we're going to look at is no association. This association or lack of an association is comparing a person's shoe size to their test score. And of course, we would not expect there to be any relationship between the size of a person's shoe and the score that they get on a test. What this looks like on a graph is points being randomly scattered. There's no clear pattern, and what this tells us is that shoe size does not predict a person's test score. And so when you have something that is no association, it will look like the points are randomly scattered across the graph. And this means there's no relationship between the two variables. One of them, your independent variable, does not predict your dependent variable. So in summary, we have learned that scatter plots can show different types of associations, positive, negative, or nonlinear. And then sometimes the scatter plots show us no association at all when we get a completely random pattern. In the next lesson, we're going to begin learning how to draw trend lines to model these positive and negative linear relationships so that we can do a little bit better job of making predictions or sort of making specific statements about the types of patterns they are. Rather than just saying they're positive or negative, we can say how positive or how negative the lines tend to be.